want you to hit me as hard as...
This is how I met Tyler Durden.
Here!
No, wait, back up. Let me start earlier.
You can't die from insomnia.
What about narcolepsy? Wake up in strange places.
So make and I sell soap.
Tyler Durden.
Jesus, I'm sorry.
Oh, that was perfect.
Hello? Found a new one.
Really?
We were finding out more and more that we were not alone. It was on. Tyler and I just gave it a name.
Gentlemen, the rule of Fight Club is you do not talk about Fight Club. Second, do not talk about Fight Club.
You're not the car you drive. You're not the contents of your wallet.
Been raised on television to believe that one day we'd all be millionaires and movie gods and very, very pissed off.
Some of it, yeah. Tyler, what is going on here?
I think you know.
In Tyler we trusted.
Hey, what if your biggest enemy was hiding inside your own mind the whole time? Tamar Fight Club 1999 is packed with shocking twists, hidden details, and mind blowing facts that will completely change how you see this cult classic. Subscribe to Reviews Voila for epic movie reviews, crazy facts, and ending breakdowns you won't want to miss. Fight Club is a 1999 American psychological drama directed by David Fincher and starring Brad Pitt, Edward Norton, and Helena Bonham Carter. The movie is based on Chuck Palahniuk's best-selling 1996 novel of the same name. Edward Norton plays an unnamed narrator who feels completely burned out by his boring office job and empty everyday routine. Feeling lost and frustrated with modern life, he meets a confident and unpredictable soap salesman named Tyler Durden, played by Brad Pitt. The two decide to start an underground fight club where ordinary men can let out their anger and frustration through bare knuckle fights. As the story moves forward, the narrator also becomes involved with Marla Singer, a mysterious and troubled woman played by Helena Bonham Carter. Her unpredictable personality adds even more tension and confusion to his already complicated life. The movie started as a film adaptation of Chuck Palahniuk's novel. After producer Laura Ziskin from Fox 2000 Pictures secured the rights to bring the book to the big screen. Screenwriter Jim Ulls was hired to adapt the story into a screenplay, and David Fincher was chosen to direct because he immediately connected with the novel's message and saw its potential as a unique and unforgettable film. Fincher worked closely with Ulls throughout the production, constantly improving the script and even asking the cast and other filmmakers for ideas to make the story stronger. Filming took place in and around Los Angeles between July and December 1998. During production, Fincher and the cast often compared the movie to classic films, like Rebel Without a Cause and The Graduate, believing Fight Club captured the frustration, confusion, and identity crisis experienced by many people in Generation X, while also criticizing society's obsession with advertising, consumerism, and material success. Before the movie came out, many studio executives weren't sure how to market it because they felt its dark themes and unusual story would be difficult to sell to mainstream audiences. As a result, they changed David Fincher's original marketing plan in hopes of reducing possible financial losses. Fight Club had its world premiere at the 56th Venice International Film Festival on September 10, 1999, before opening in theaters across the United States on October 15th, 1999, through 20th Century Fox. At first, the movie didn't perform as well as the studio had hoped at the box office, and critics were deeply divided. While some praised its bold storytelling, directing, and performances, others criticized its violence and controversial themes. Because of these mixed reactions, Fight Club quickly became one of the most talked about and debated movies of the 1990s. Even though its theatrical run wasn't considered a huge success, the movie's reputation completely changed after it was released on home video. As more people discovered it through DVD and home rentals, Fight Club built a massive fan following and slowly became a true cult classic. Viewers began appreciating its smart storytelling, unforgettable performances, powerful social commentary, and shocking plot twists. Over the years, critics and audiences started looking at the film in a completely different way, recognizing it as one of David Fincher's greatest achievements. By 2009, on the movie's 10th anniversary, the New York Times called Fight Club the defining cult movie of our time, proving just how much its influence had grown. Today, it remains one of the most iconic, discussed, and analyzed films ever made, continuing to inspire debates and fan theories more than 2 decades after its original release. The story follows an unnamed man, played by Edward Norton, who works for a major car company. His job is to travel to accident scenes and figure out whether it's cheaper for the company to recall defective vehicles or simply pay compensation to the victims. If paying claims costs less than fixing the problem, the company doesn't issue a recall. Even though he has a decent paying job, his life feels completely empty. He's stuck in a boring routine, can't sleep, and spends his free time buying expensive furniture and decorating his apartment exactly like the pages of an IKEA catalog. Everything in his home looks perfect, but inside, he's miserable. The narrator suffers from severe insomnia and hasn't been able to sleep for 6 months. When he asks his doctor for sleeping pills, the doctor refuses and tells him that if he wants to see what real pain looks like, he should attend a support group for men with testicular cancer. Curious, he goes to one of the meetings. Seeing people who are actually dealing with life changing illnesses overwhelms him emotionally. For the first time in months, he breaks down and cries. There he meets Bob Paulson, a former bodybuilder who lost his testicles because of cancer. Bob comforts him with a hug, and the narrator finally gets the emotional release he desperately needed. That night, he sleeps peacefully for the first time in months after realizing how much the meetings help. He starts pretending to have different illnesses so he can attend other support groups and continue releasing all the emotions he's been holding inside. Everything changes when another fake attendee named Marla Singer, played by Helena Bonham Carter, starts showing up at the same meetings. The narrator immediately realizes she's lying just like he is, and her presence ruins the experience for him. Since he knows she's pretending, he can no longer let himself cry, and his insomnia returns. Eventually, the two agree to split up the meetings so they won't run into each other. They exchange contact information just in case they ever need to reach one another, although neither of them is happy about the arrangement. While flying on another business trip, the narrator meets a confident and charismatic soap salesman named Tyler Durden, played by Brad Pitt. Tyler has a completely different outlook on life and talks about freedom, consumer culture, and how everyday household items can be surprisingly dangerous. After the trip, the narrator returns home only to discover that his apartment has been completely destroyed in a massive explosion, which authorities believe was caused by a gas leak. With nowhere else to go, he first calls Marla, but hangs up without saying anything. Then he contacts Tyler, whose phone number he still has from the flight. They meet at a bar where Tyler makes an unusual request. Before allowing the narrator to stay at his house, Tyler tells him to hit him as hard as he can. Confused but curious, the narrator throws a punch, and the two end up having an intense fist fight outside the bar. Surprisingly, both of them enjoy the experience and feel more alive than they have in years. Tyler lives in a rundown old house that's falling apart. The windows are boarded up, the stairs are barely safe to use, and the front door doesn't even have a proper lock. The narrator moves in, and the two quickly become close friends. They continue fighting each other outside the bar, and before long, other men become interested in joining. This leads to the creation of Fight Club, a secret underground group where ordinary men gather to settle their frustrations through bare knuckle fights. The club follows a strict set of rules. Members are never allowed to talk about Fight Club outside its walls. Fighters compete one match at a time, wear no shirts or shoes during fights, and every newcomer must step into the ring for their very first meeting. What starts as a simple way to blow off steam soon grows into something much bigger. Marla eventually calls the narrator and asks why he suddenly stopped going to the support groups. He simply tells her that he found a different kind of support group. That same night, he dreams about being with Marla romantically. Later, he wakes up to find Marla at Tyler's house after she and Tyler have become involved with each other. The narrator is completely confused because he has no idea how she ended up there. Marla is equally confused by his strange behavior and leaves feeling frustrated and upset. It turns out Marla had accidentally overdosed on Xanax, and Tyler was the one who rescued her after answering a phone call meant for the narrator. From that point on, Tyler and Marla begin a complicated relationship. Tyler also makes the narrator promise never to discuss him with Marla under any circumstances. As Fight Club grows larger, Tyler transforms it into something much more extreme called Project Mayhem. Instead of just fighting, members now carry out organized acts of vandalism and destruction aimed at challenging big corporations and modern society. Fight clubs begin appearing in cities all across the country, forming a huge underground network. As Tyler becomes more focused on Project Mayhem, the narrator notices he's being pushed further and further away from Tyler's plans. When one of the members dies during a dangerous mission, the narrator realizes things have gone too far and decides he has to stop the organization before more people get hurt. Trying to find Tyler, the narrator travels across the country, visiting different fight clubs in several major cities. Everywhere he goes, members strangely recognize him as Tyler Durden. At first, he has no idea what they're talking about. A conversation with Marla finally helps him understand the shocking truth. Tyler Durden isn't a separate person at all. He is actually another personality living inside the narrator's mind. Tyler represents everything the narrator wishes he could be: fearless, confident, physically strong, aggressive, charming, and completely free from fear or social expectations. Whenever the narrator falls asleep or blacks out, Tyler takes control of his body and carries out his own plans. Realizing this truth completely overwhelms the narrator, causing him to collapse as everything suddenly makes sense. When he wakes up, the narrator discovers that Tyler has already set the final stage of Project Mayhem into motion. Tyler has secretly organized a plan to destroy the headquarters of several major credit card companies by planting powerful explosives inside their buildings. His goal is to erase financial records and throw the entire economic system into chaos. The narrator desperately tries to stop the plan, but many police officers have secretly joined Project Mayhem and refuse to help him. He attempts to disable the bombs himself, but is confronted by Tyler. After a violent struggle, the narrator is knocked unconscious and later wakes up on the top floor of one of the targeted buildings, where Tyler forces him to watch the final phase of the plan unfold. In the final confrontation, the narrator realizes that because Tyler exists only in his own mind, he is actually the one holding the gun. Understanding that hurting himself is the only way to destroy Tyler's control, he fires the gun through his own cheek without taking his own life. The injury causes Tyler's illusion to disappear completely. Moments later, members of Project Mayhem bring Marla to the building before leaving the two of them alone. As the explosives go off across the city, the narrator and Marla stand side by side, holding hands and watching several massive buildings collapse through the windows. The movie ends with one of the most unforgettable scenes in modern cinema, leaving viewers to think about identity, consumer culture, freedom, and the consequences of losing control over one's own mind. The casting of Edward Norton as the narrator marked one of the pivotal decisions that shaped the film's voice and tone. Asterisk. David Fincher had been impressed by Norton's performance in The People vs. Larry Flynn, 1996, where the actor played a guileless lawyer with nuance and vulnerability that aligned perfectly with the insomniac, consumerist trapped office worker who narrates the story. The studio initially pushed for a bigger, sexier marquee name like Matt Damon or Sean Penn to boost commercial prospects. But Fincher held firm on Norton, then in his late 20s, committed deeply. He was juggling multiple offers, including Man on the Moon, The Talented Mr. Ripley, and Runaway Jury, but chose Fight Club to embody the physically unremarkable narrator, contrasting sharply with Tyler Durden's sculpted physique. Norton lost around 20 pounds through running and a strict regimen after bulking up for American History X. His preparation extended to boxing, taekwondo, grappling, and even soap making classes alongside Pitt, immersing the leads in the material's subversive undercurrents. This physical transformation underscored the character's duality. The narrator starts as a buttoned up everyman, fraying at the edges as Tyler emerges. Norton's comedic timing, honed through his understanding of the script as a dark satire, brought sarcasm and self awareness to the voiceover narration. Fincher and Norton clashed at times over tone, Norton emphasizing the comedy, Fincher the visceral edge. But their collaboration yielded a performance that anchors the film's psychological unraveling. The actor's willingness to go method, including a real punch to Pitt's ear in one fight scene, prompted by Fincher for authenticity, added raw energy. Brad Pitt's selection as Tyler Durden brought star power and a magnetic, dangerous charisma essential to the character's cult leader allure. Producers considered Russell Crowe early on, with Ross Bell meeting him to discuss the role. However, senior producer Art Linson advocated for Pitt, who signed on for $17.5 million dollars after the domestic disappointment of Meet Joe Black. The studio saw Pitt as a draw for broader appeal. Pitt, at 35 during filming, underwent an intense physical overhaul. He had pieces of his front teeth chipped by a dentist for Tyler's imperfect, lived in look, rested post production, and followed a rigorous workout split, focusing on shoulders, chest, back, and arms to achieve the godlike physique that embodies hyper masculine fantasy. Like Norton, he trained in combat disciplines and soap making. His commitment extended to wardrobe and presence. Tyler's slick, anarchic style contrasted the narrator's drab existence, making the twists reveal hit harder. Pitt's star persona, wealthy, desired, yet disillusioned, mirrored Tyler's critiques of consumerism. Off screen, his dynamic with Norton fostered levity. They laughed constantly on set, even smoking a joint before the Venice premiere, where the film's reception amused them amid formal discomfort. Pitt also influenced other casting, notably advocating for Helena Bonham Carter by showing Fincher her emotionally raw sex scenes from The Wings of the Dove. Helena Bonham Carter's Marla Singer emerged after a contentious search that highlighted studio director tensions. Fincher's initial preference was Janine Garofalo, who claimed she was promised the role but lost it due to Norton's alleged preference for his then girlfriend, Courtney Love. A claim Norton disputed, emphasizing Fincher's control. Other contenders included Winona Ryder, Reese Witherspoon, whom Fincher deemed too young and who turned it down for being too dark, and Julia Louis Dreyfus. Bonham Carter, 33 at the time, won out thanks to her Oscar nominated work in The Wings of the Dove. Her mother reportedly called the script a pollutant, reflecting its provocative nature, but Carter met Fincher to gauge his intentions, ensuring no misogyny. She based elements of Marla on Judy Garland's later persona, chaotic, vulnerable, chain smoking, nihilism. Bonham Carter's eccentric energy brought biting wit and pathos to lines like, I haven't been fucked like that since grade school, making Marla the chaotic counterpoint to the male lead spiral. Her chemistry with both Norton and Pitt Using body doubles for explicit scenes grounded the film's emotional core. Marla's thrift store chaos and suicidal tendencies provided the human stakes amid the anarchy, preventing the story from becoming purely abstract. Bonham Carter's commitment, including left handed makeup application for authenticity in scenes, added layers of eccentricity. Asterisk. Supporting players like Meat Loaf as Robert Bob Paulson added memorable humanity and humor. The rock star, credited as Meat Loaf Ade, portrayed the testicular cancer survivor with bitch tits from hormone therapy. He wore a heavy fat suit with flaxseed filled prosthetic breasts, weighing 28 pounds each, gaining empathy for larger bodied experiences. Bob's Ernest were still men moments and later Project Mayhem involvement. His name was Robert Paulson, became iconic. Meat Loaf shadowed Fincher during editing, contributing insights over months on set. Asterisk. Jared Leto as Angel Face brought angelic beauty turned brutal. Leto, then rising from My So-Called Life, embodied the pretty devoted space monkey whose beating by the narrator highlights the club's escalating violence. Pitt reportedly influenced his look. Leto's commitment to the role's physicality and cult-like devotion amplified themes of blind loyalty. The ensemble filled out the world with precision under casting director Larry Mayfield. Asterisk. Zach Grenay as the narrator's boss enabled the blackmail subplot. Holt McCallany as the mechanic delivered menacing loyalty. Eon Bailey as Ricky, Christina Cabot as a support group leader, and others like Richmond Arquette, hospital intern, and David Andrews grounded the support groups and Project Mayhem. Many had Fincher connections or fit the gritty, authentic vibe, casting extended to cameos and uncredited roles. These choices enriched the texture, making the underground feel lived in. The casting process reflected broader production battles. Fincher navigated studio desires for commercial viability against his vision of satirical bite. Salaries, Pitt's high fee versus Norton's $2.5 million underscored star dynamics, yet the lead's preparation and camaraderie elevated the material. Physical transformations, combat training, and soap making classes bonded the cast while embodying themes. Controversies like Garofalo's account or body double intimacy for sex scenes added layers to the lore. Asterisk. Supporting and background casting amplified the film's critique of masculinity and consumerism. Fighters, space monkeys, and support group members were chosen for authenticity. Ex-boxers, everyday men channeling frustration. This created a believable movement from loose tavern brawls to paper street house chaos. Makeup effects combined with actor physicality heightened visceral impact. Interactions between leads defined the film's energy. Asterisk. Norton and Pitt's real punches, laughter, and joint pre-premiere antics contrasted the dark material. Bonham Carter's outsider perspective as the sole major female lead balanced the testosterone. Her scenes with Pitt choreographed intricately, pushing boundaries. Fincher's perfectionism, multiple takes, stitched edits, demanded endurance, yet fostered standout performances. Casting decisions influenced the twist's effectiveness. Norton's everyman vulnerability made the Tyler reveal shocking yet logical. Pitt's charisma sold the fantasy, while Bonham Carter's Marla provided the emotional tether. Alternatives like Crow or Damon might have shifted commercial tone, but diluted the intimate psychological portrait. The final ensemble captured generational malaise with precision. Ask. Larry Mayfield's work as casting director ensured cohesion. Longtime Fincher collaborator, she helped assemble a mix of stars, character actors, and fresh faces that populated the dystopian world. Extras casting for fights and rallies added scale. Uncredited roles and cameos rewarded eagle eyed viewers, deepening rewatch value. Physical and transformative elements defined many performances. Pate's dental work and workouts, Norton's weight loss, Meat Loaf's prosthetics, Leto's bleached look, each choice externalized internal conflicts. Bonham Carter's disheveled aesthetic and erratic mannerisms made Marla indelible. These commitments turned casting into embodiment, amplifying themes of identity fragmentation. The cast's post release reflections highlight the experience's intensity. Norton recalled constant laughter amid darkness. Pitt discussed disillusionment with success, mirroring Tyler's philosophy. Bonham Carter navigated initial script repulsion to deliver a career highlight. Meatloaf's editing contributions showed investment beyond acting. These bonds turned a challenging shoot into cult legacy fuel. Broader context of 1990s casting trends informed choices. Post the 7N. Fincher leveraged Pitt's draw while prioritizing fit over fame for key roles. Norton's rising indie cred fit the era's edgier fare. Bonham Carter's British eccentricity contrasted Hollywood gloss, suiting Mala's anti-establishment vibe. The ensemble avoided pure star vehicles, favoring thematic resonance. Asterisk. Fight Club's casting ultimately succeeded through tension, studio versus director, star versus substance, physicality versus psychology. It produced performances that remain studied for their depth, chemistry, and cultural impact, cementing the film's status as a provocative masterpiece of late 20th century cinema. The choices enabled exploration of masculinity, identity, and rebellion with unforgettable faces and bodies. Production development and pre production. The story of how Fight Club reached the screen begins not with a screenwriter or a director, but with a book scout working for Fox Searchlight Pictures. Before Chuck Palahniuk's 1996 novel had even been formally published, this scout passed along an early galley proof to a creative executive at the studio named Kevin McCormick. McCormick, following the usual studio process, handed the manuscript to an in house reader whose job was to assess its suitability for adaptation. That reader came back unenthusiastic and recommended against pursuing it. It is worth pausing on that fact alone. The film that would eventually be called one of the defining cult movies of its era was almost strangled in its crib by a single unfavorable coverage report, the kind of internal document that kills far more scripts than any public rejection ever could. McCormick did not let the matter drop entirely. He forwarded the galley to two established producers, Lawrence Bender and Art Linson, hoping one of them might see something the in house reader had missed. Both passed. At this point, the novel might easily have died as a film property altogether, the fate of countless books optioned and then quietly abandoned. Instead, it found its way to a pair of younger producers, Josh Donen and Ross Bell, who reacted very differently. Where others had seen an unfilmable, transgressive novel about masculinity, violence, and consumer nihilism, Donen and Bell saw an opportunity. Rather than simply pitching the book on faith, the two producers devised an unusual method of proving its potential. They organized unpaid table readings with actors, partly to gauge how the material played out loud, and partly to get a sense of how long a script might run if it stayed faithful to the novel's structure and dialogue. The first of these readings reportedly took 6 hours to complete, an unwieldy length that told the producers plenty about how much trimming any workable screenplay would need. They went back and cut the material down, then used the shortened version to record a new set of dialogue readings. This recording became their calling card. Bell sent the tape to Laura Ziskin, who at the time ran Fox 2000 Pictures, the specialty division of 20th Century Fox aimed at slightly riskier, non-tentpole material. Ziskin listened to the recording and was sufficiently convinced to buy the film rights to Fight Club from Palahniuk for $10,000, a modest sum that reflected the novel's unproven commercial status at the time, long before it had built the reputation it would eventually enjoy. With the rights secured, Ziskin turned her attention to who might write the adaptation. Her first instinct was to approach Buck Henry, the veteran screenwriter whose credits included the adaptation of The Graduate, the 1967 film that would later become a constant point of comparison for Fight Club itself. Ziskin's reasoning made sense on its face. Both stories were, at bottom, about a directionless young man alienated from the life that respectable society expected him to want. But before that pairing could be finalized, a screenwriter named Jim Ulls lobbied Donen and Bell directly for the job. Ulls had encountered the novel in manuscript form before it even had a finished cover, and by his own account, he simply read it for pleasure and came away astonished by it. That enthusiasm, communicated persistently to the producers, won him the assignment over the more experienced. Henry, securing a screenwriter was only half the puzzle. The producer still needed a director willing and able to steer such abrasive material through a major studio system. Bell approached the project methodically, reaching out to four different directors he considered plausible candidates. His first choice was Peter Jackson, a filmmaker Bell rated above the others under consideration, but Jackson was tied up at the time filming The Frighteners in New Zealand and unavailable. Bryan Singer was sent a copy of the book, but notably never got around to reading it. Danny Boyle did meet with Bell and did read the material, but ultimately chose to pursue a different project instead. The novel was also passed along to David O. Russell, who reportedly found it too difficult to make sense of and declined on those grounds. That left David Fincher, who arrived at the project from an unusual angle. He had already read Fight Club on his own initiative and had in fact tried unsuccessfully to buy the film rights himself before Fox 2000 ever got involved. When Ziskin reached out, the two talked about the possibility of Fincher directing. His hesitation had nothing to do with the material itself, which he clearly wanted to work on, and everything to do with his history with the studio. Fincher's previous experience, directing 1992's Alien 3 for 20th Century Fox, had been famously difficult, a production plagued by interference and reshoots that left him publicly soured on studio filmmaking. To smooth over that history before committing to another Fox project, Fincher arranged a meeting with both Ziskin and studio chief Bill Mechanic, effectively repairing bridges before building a new structure on top of them. The effort paid off. In August 1997, Fox formally announced that Fincher would direct the adaptation. One of Fincher's first substantive interventions in the script concerned narration. Alz's initial draft had deliberately excluded a voiceover, largely because at that point in the 1990s, voiceover narration was widely regarded within the industry as a lazy, old fashioned crutch, hackneyed and trite in the prevailing shorthand. Fincher disagreed with that orthodoxy in this particular case. He felt that a great deal of the film's comedy lived specifically in the narrator's interior voice, and that without it, the story read as simply sad and pathetic rather than darkly funny. The script was revised to restore first person narration, a choice that would go on to define the film's tone as much as any single visual decision Fincher made. From there, Fincher and Alls spent 6 to 7 months refining the screenplay together. By 1997, they had produced a third draft that reordered major sections of the story and cut a number of elements found in the novel. Once Brad Pitt came aboard to play Tyler Durden, he raised a concern of his own. He felt the character as written was too flat, too much a single note ideologue rather than a fully dimensional figure. Fincher, taking the note seriously, sought outside advice from writer director Cameron Crowe, who suggested deliberately building more ambiguity into Tyler rather than resolving him into a clean archetype. Fincher also brought in screenwriter Andrew Kevin Walker, best known for writing Fincher's earlier film Seven, to help further shape the material. From that point, the circle of collaborators widened further still. Fincher invited both Pitt and Edward Norton into the writer's room, and the four of them worked through 5 additional rounds of revisions over roughly a year, an unusually collaborative process for a major studio production, closer in spirit to workshopping a play than polishing a traditional screenplay. Palahniuk himself, watching this adaptation process from the outside, later spoke warmly of the result, praising the filmmakers for producing a more streamlined narrative than his own novel and for staying faithful to its spirit. One point of internal debate among the writers concerned the novel's climactic twist, the revelation that Tyler Durden is not a separate person, but a dissociated projection of the narrator's own mind. There was real uncertainty among the creative team about whether audiences would accept a twist of that magnitude within a mainstream release. Fincher argued forcefully that they should trust the setup. If viewers had stayed invested through everything leading up to that point, they would follow the film the rest of the way. That confidence in the audience's patience turned out to be justified, though not without cost at the box office, as later sections of this account make clear. Fincher also chose to preserve, and in some ways sharpen, a homoerotic undercurrent present in Palahniuk's novel, using it deliberately to unsettle audiences and heighten the eventual shock of the film's twists. A scene in which Tyler bathes beside the narrator carries a loaded line about whether another woman is really the solution the narrator needs. A moment intended to gesture toward personal responsibility rather than literal sexual confusion, though its ambiguity was clearly by design. An earlier scene in which Tyler forces a gun barrel into the narrator's mouth carries similar charged undertones. The ending itself represented one of the more significant departures from the source material. In Palahniuk's novel, the narrator's fate closes with his confinement in a mental institution, a more clinical and less redemptive conclusion. Fincher and his collaborators chose instead to have the narrator find something closer to redemption by consciously rejecting Tyler's worldview at the story's climax. Norton, reflecting on the change, drew an explicit line back to the graduate, suggesting that both films ultimately show their protagonists locating a middle ground between two warring versions of themselves rather than surrendering fully to either. Finch's own explanation for the change centered on his discomfort with how enamored the novel seemed with Tyler Durden as a figure. He wanted audiences to feel Tyler's charisma and appeal, but he also wanted them to be at peace with his defeat by the film's end, rather than mourning his loss. Casting decisions proved almost as contentious and drawn out as the writing process. For the role of Tyler Durden, producer Ross Bell initially met with Russell Crowe to gauge his interest and suitability. Art Linson, who joined the production later than Bell but held greater seniority among the producing team, instead met with Brad Pitt about the same role. Because Linson outranked Bell within the production hierarchy, the studio ultimately steered toward Pitt. The timing suited Pitt's own career needs. His 1998 film Meet Joe Black had underperformed domestically, and he was actively looking for a new project. The studio, for its part, calculated that a genuine marquee star would improve the film's commercial prospects given its abrasive subject matter, and signed Pitt for a reported $17.5 million. The role of the unnamed narrator proved harder to settle. Studio executives initially pushed for what they described as a sexier marquee name, floating Matt Damon and Sean Penn as possibilities who might better anchor the film commercially alongside Pitt. Fincher had other ideas. He had been struck by Edward Norton's performance in 1996's The People vs. Larry Flynt and pushed for Norton specifically. Norton's stock in Hollywood was rising quickly at the time. His Academy Award nomination for that earlier role had put him in demand for a wave of new leading parts, including a previous attachment to a legal thriller, Runaway Jury, that stalled out after director Joel Schumacher dropped out of that project in mid 1997. Fox ultimately offered Norton $2.5 million to play the narrator, though there was a complication. Norton still owed Paramount Pictures a film under a prior contractual obligation, one that specified a smaller salary than his rising status would normally command. He could not immediately accept the Fight Club offer as a result, and did not fully satisfy his obligation to Paramount until several years later when he appeared in 2003's The Italian Job. Despite the scheduling entanglement, 20th Century Fox announced in January 1998 that both Pitt and Norton had officially been cast. Once cast, both actors undertook physical preparation well beyond typical star treatment. They trained in boxing, taekwondo, and grappling to make the film's fight choreography look convincing under the camera. And, in a smaller but telling detail, both took lessons in soap making, given Tyler Durden's occupation as an artisanal soap salesman in the story. Pitt went further still in pursuit of authenticity. He voluntarily visited a dentist to have small pieces of his front teeth chipped away so that Tyler would not present the impossibly perfect smile of a conventional movie star. The chips were later restored once filming wrapped a small temporary sacrifice in service of a character meant to embody a kind of dangerous, unpolished charisma. Norton, for his part, approached his physical transformation as a kind of visual argument built into the film itself. He and the filmmakers decided that as the story progressed, his character would appear to waste away, growing gaunt, undernourished, and depleted, while Pitt's Tyler Durden would grow correspondingly more physically idealized, lifting weights and visiting tanning beds, so that his appearance became more chiseled and golden as the film went on. The effect was meant to visually dramatize the widening gulf between the narrator's depleted real world existence and the increasingly seductive, larger than life fantasy that Tyler represented in his mind. Casting Mala Singer proved to be the most turbulent process of all, cycling through numerous candidates before settling on Helena Bonham Carter. Fincher's first choice for the role was comedian and actress Janine Garofalo. For years, the official account held that Garofalo turned the role down due to discomfort with the film's sexual content. But Garofalo herself offered a different version of events in a 2020 interview, saying that she had in fact accepted the part and was only removed from consideration afterward because Edward Norton felt she was poorly suited to it. Beyond Garofalo, Fincher also pitched the role to Julia Louis-Dreyfus, and the filmmaking team considered both Courtney Love and Winona Ryder as early possibilities. Love has publicly claimed she was cast in the role at one point, but was subsequently fired after she declined a pitch from Pitt involving a film project about her late husband, Kurt Cobain, an account that, if accurate, points to just how tangled the behind the scenes politics of the casting process became. The studio, meanwhile, pushed for Reese Witherspoon, but Fincher felt she read as too young for the part. Sarah Michelle Gellar was also considered, but turned the role down due to scheduling conflicts tied to her commitments on Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Fincher eventually settled on Helena Bonham Carter, drawn to her work in the 1997 film The Wings of the Dove, and the choice proved durable. Bonham Carter's performance would later earn her a British Acting Award tied to the film. Financing the project brought its own turbulence. Studio executives Bill Mechanic and Laura Ziskin initially planned a comparatively modest budget of $23 million. By the time production actually began, that a figure had already more than doubled to roughly $50 million, half of which was financed by New Regency, the production company headed by Arnon Milchan. Cost continued climbing during filming itself, with the projected budget eventually reaching around $67 million. Alarmed by the escalating figures, Milchan, who also served as an executive producer on the film, pushed Fincher to cut at least $5 million from the budget. Fincher refused outright. In response, Milchan threatened to pull New Regency's financing from the project entirely, a threat serious enough that it could have shut the production down midstream. Mechanic worked to defuse the standoff by sending Milchan tapes of the daily footage as it was shot. After reviewing roughly 3 weeks' worth of dailies, Milchan relented and reinstated New Regency's financial commitment. The final production budget settled somewhere between $63 million and $65 million, a substantial sum for a film whose tone and subject matter made its commercial prospects genuinely uncertain even to the people financing it. Filming principal photography stretched across 138 days, running from July through December of 1998, a notably long shooting schedule for a studio drama of this kind, reflecting both the technical complexity of the production and Fincher's exacting, take-heavy directing style. Over that period, Fincher shot more than 4,500 rolls of film, roughly 3 times the average consumption for a comparable Hollywood production, a figure that speaks to how meticulously he covered scenes and how many alternate takes he generated before settling on final choices in the edit. The production was based primarily in and around Los Angeles, supplemented by sets constructed at the studio's facilities in Century City. Production designer Alex McDowell built more than 70 distinct sets to accommodate the film's sprawling geography, which ultimately included around 300 individual scenes filmed across roughly 200 separate locations, along with an array of technically demanding visual effects sequences. The scale of this undertaking became something Fincher himself would later reflect on with a degree of exhausted humor, comparing the experience unfavorably to his later comparatively contained film Panic Room. He recalled feeling that an enormous portion of his time on Fight Club was consumed simply watching equipment trucks being loaded and unloaded in order to capture what often amounted to only a few lines of dialogue. Among the most elaborate physical builds was Tyler Durden's decaying house, the dilapidated structure that serves as the film's central gathering point and staging ground for Project Mayhem. Its exterior was constructed on location in Wilmington, California, a working-class port community south of downtown Los Angeles, chosen for its weathered industrial atmosphere. The interior of the house, by contrast, was built entirely on a soundstage at the studio, allowing the production designers full control over its appearance. That interior was deliberately given a decayed, crumbling look, intended as a physical embodiment of the psychological deconstruction the characters were undergoing over the course of the story. Marla Singer's own apartment, meanwhile, was designed with reference to actual photographs the production team gathered of real apartments in downtown Los Angeles, grounding her fictional living space in a specific, recognizable urban texture rather than an invented studio aesthetic. The fight sequences themselves were heavily choreographed in advance, but Fincher and his stunt team pushed the actors to commit fully and physically to each exchange, aiming for a realism that included details like actors visibly having the wind knocked out of them during blows. To support that realism, makeup artist Julie Pierce, who had previously worked with Fincher on 1997's The Game, immersed herself in research on mixed martial arts and pay per view boxing to understand how real fighters' bodies and faces register damage over the course of a match. In one striking detail of craft, she designed a prosthetic effect for an extra depicting a missing chunk of ear cartilage, a direct visual reference to the infamous 1997 boxing match in which Mike Tyson bit off part of Evander Holyfield's ear during their rematch. Pierce's team also devised two distinct techniques for producing on cue sweat during takes: spraying mineral water over a base layer of Vaseline for a glistening effect, and using plain, unadulterated water when a more genuinely wet appearance of sweat was called for. Meat Loaf, cast as the Fight Club member Robert Bob Paulson, whose character has developed enlarged breast tissue as a side effect of testicular cancer treatment, wore a specially built fat suit, weighing roughly 90 pounds to achieve the character's altered physique, along with 8-inch lifts in his shoes during scenes alongside Norton, so that he would tower over him as the physical presence the character required. Visually, Fincher shot the film using the Super 35 format, a choice driven by the flexibility it gave him in framing and composing shots without being locked into a narrower theatrical aspect ratio during production. He brought in Jeff Cronenweth as his cinematographer for the project, a choice with its own layer of history. Cronenweth's father, Jordan Cronenweth, had served as cinematographer on Fincher's earlier Alien 3 before Parkinson's disease, forced him to leave the production partway through. Fincher and the younger Cronenweth drew visual inspiration from Fincher's two prior features, Seven and The Game, carrying forward elements of the moody, textured look he had cultivated on those earlier projects. Fincher and Cronenweth settled on a deliberately lurid visual style for much of the film, aiming for an appearance in which people and surfaces looked almost unnaturally shiny or slick. The scenes depicting the narrator's ordinary life without Tyler present were shot with a more bland, straightforwardly realistic look, in contrast to the scenes involving Tyler, which Fincher described as more hyper-real, deliberately torn down, and deconstructed in appearance, a visual metaphor, in his words, for the psychological unraveling the narrator was heading toward. Throughout, the filmmakers leaned on heavily desaturated color choices across costuming, makeup, and overall art direction. Bonham Carter's makeup, in particular, was designed with an opalescent quality intended to suggest a kind of romantic nihilism, evoking what was described as a heroin addict's sheen to her complexion. For further inspiration, Fincher and Cronenweth looked to the 1973 film American Graffiti, admiring how that film applied a mundane visual texture to its nighttime exteriors while still finding room for a surprising variety of color within that muted palette. Lighting decisions throughout the shoot balanced natural sources with practical on-set fixtures. Fincher chose specific urban locations, partly for how city lights would register in the backgrounds of shots, and the crew made frequent use of ordinary fluorescent lighting at practical locations, both to preserve a grounded sense of reality and to properly illuminate the various prosthetic effects depicting the characters accumulating injuries over the course of the story. At the same time, Fincher deliberately avoided lighting his actors' faces too brightly, wanting their eyes to remain partially obscured in a number of scenes, a technique he credited to the influence of cinematographer Gordon Willis, Famous for his shadow heavy work on films like The Godfather, much of Fight Club was shot at night, and where daytime scenes were unavoidable, Fincher sought out shadowed or covered locations to maintain visual continuity with the film's nocturnal atmosphere. For the basement space beneath the bar where the original Fight Club meets, the crew rigged the space with inexpensive work lamps to create a dim background glow, appropriate to an unlicensed underground gathering. In the earliest fight sequences set in that basement, Fincher deliberately avoided any flashy camera movement, keeping the camera locked in a fixed position to emphasize the raw, unpolished nature of these first encounters. As the fights escalated later in the film, his camera language evolved along with them, shifting from the vantage point of a distant, detached observer to something closer to the physical perspective of the fighters themselves, tightening the audience's identification with the violence as the story progressed. A great deal of technical care went into disguising the fact that Tyler Durden exists only as a projection inside the narrator's mind, a twist the filmmakers wanted to conceal until its reveal without resorting to any obvious visual trickery. Tyler was never filmed in a conventional two shot alongside a group of other characters, and he was never shown from an over the shoulder angle in scenes where he manipulates the narrator with specific ideas or instructions. Subtle grammatical choices in the visual language, meant to keep him slightly apart from ordinary cinematic space, even when audiences had no conscious reason yet to notice the difference. In the stretch of the film before the narrator formally meets Tyler, the filmmakers went further still, inserting Tyler's image into single frames scattered through earlier scenes as a subliminal effect, visible only as a flicker too brief for most viewers to consciously register on a first viewing. Elsewhere, Tyler appears out of focus in the background of shots, described by the filmmakers as functioning like a little devil on the shoulder, present at the margins of the frame, well before he becomes central to the story. Fincher explained the logic behind these subliminal insertions directly. At that stage of the story, the narrator is only beginning to create Tyler Durden within his own mind. So, the character's presence had to exist merely on the periphery of the narrator's consciousness, matching form to psychological content. The film stock itself was manipulated in several deliberate ways to achieve its final look. Cronenweth generally exposed the Kodak film stock normally rather than pushing or pulling it dramatically, but a range of laboratory techniques were applied afterward to alter its appearance. Flashing, a technique that exposes the film to a small amount of additional light before or after the main exposure, was used extensively on the exterior night photography to soften and desaturate the image. The contrast was stretched intentionally to look somewhat ugly and harsh rather than conventionally polished. Prints were adjusted to appear underexposed, and Technicolor's ENR process, a silver retention technique that deepens blacks by preserving more silver in the print, was applied to a select number of prints to intensify the darkest areas of the image. High contrast print stocks were also selected specifically to give the finished film a stepped on, dirty patina, as though the image itself had been roughed up in keeping with the story's themes. Visual effects work, meanwhile, was overseen by supervisor Kevin Todd Hogg, who had also worked with Fincher on the game. Hogg organized the effects work across multiple specialized facilities, each handling a different aspect of the process. Some focused on computer generated modeling, others on animation, compositing, or scanning. A division of labor he felt allowed each team to focus purely on its own strengths rather than being stretched across tasks outside its core competency. Fincher conceived of much of the visual language as representing the narrator's own interior, mind's eye perspective, building what has been described as a deliberately myopic visual framework for the audience to inhabit alongside him. To manage the technical risk of the film's more ambitious effects shots, the production made extensive use of pre visualization, essentially rough digital mock ups of complex shots, allowing the filmmakers to work out staging and effects challenges before committing to expensive and time consuming principal photography. The most technically elaborate single sequence in the finished film is its 90-second opening title sequence, a visual effects composition depicting the interior of the narrator's brain at a microscopic scale before the camera pulls back and out into the physical world, tracing the thought processes triggered by his fear response. Fincher himself was heavily involved in designing this sequence, which was originally budgeted separately from the rest of the production before the studio formally folded its funding into the film's overall budget in January 1999. To execute the sequence, Fincher brought in the visual effects company Digital Domain along with supervisor Kevin Mack, who had previously won an Academy Award for his effects work on 1998's What Dreams May Come. Digital Domains team mapped the computer generated brain imagery using a mathematical modeling technique known as an L system, commonly used to simulate organic branching structures such as plant growth, and refined the visual detail with the help of renderings created by a medical illustrator. The full pullback sequence, tracing a path from deep within the brain out through the skull, incorporated depictions of neurons, electrical action potentials, and even a single hair follicle along the way. Hogg later described the delicate balancing act the team faced in executing Fincher's vision for the shot. The director wanted the passage through the brain to maintain the visual authenticity of actual electron microscope photography while also carrying the sensory feel of a nighttime dive, wet, unsettling, and shot with a shallow depth of field. That shallow focus effect was ultimately achieved using a ray tracing rendering process capable of simulating realistic optical depth within the fully computer generated environment. Other significant visual effect sequences populate the film as well. An early sequence in which the camera races past city streets to survey stockpiles of Project Mayhem's demolition equipment hidden in underground parking structures was built as a three-dimensional composite assembled from close to 100 individual photographs of Los Angeles and Century City, all captured by a single photographer and stitched together digitally to create the illusion of continuous camera movement through real architectural space. The film's climactic sequence, depicting the demolition of the credit card company's skyscrapers, was designed by a specialist effects artist who reportedly spent more than 14 months developing that single sequence. An enormous investment of time for a handful of minutes of finished screen time, reflecting how central that final image was to the film's overall meaning. One further visual device deserves mention for how directly it engages the audience. Midway through the film, Tyler Durden turns and points out a cigarette burn, the small circular cue mark that historically signaled a projectionist to change reels in traditional film projection directly to the camera, breaking the fourth wall in a moment, meant to mark a genuine turning point in the story. The gesture foreshadows an approaching rupture in the film's fairly subjective sense of reality up to that point. Fincher described the intended effect in blunt terms. The moment is meant to feel as though the projectionist has missed the changeover entirely, forcing the audience to suddenly reconsider everything they thought they understood about the story unfolding in front of them. Post production filming wrapped in December 1998, after which Fincher moved directly into editing the material in early 1999, working to prepare a cut suitable for an initial screening in front of the studio's senior executives. That screening did not go well. The assembled executives reacted with concern rather than enthusiasm, uncertain whether any real audience existed for a film this abrasive and morally ambiguous. Executive producer Art Linson, who remained a genuine advocate for the project throughout, later recalled the scale of the executives' unease, noting that so many individual elements of the film alarmed different people in the room that no single group of executives could even settle on which specific problems to prioritize addressing. That anxious internal reception had direct consequences for the film's release schedule. Fight Club had originally been slated for a July 1999 release before being pushed back to August 6, 1999. It was delayed again after that, this time into the autumn, with the studio publicly attributing the change to a crowded summer release schedule and an unusually hurried post production process that needed more time. Observers outside the studio offered a different, more pointed explanation for at least some of the hesitation. The delays came in the months following the Columbine High School massacre earlier that year, a tragedy that understandably made studio executives more cautious than usual about releasing a film built so explicitly around themes of male rage, violence, and organized destruction. Marketing the finished film proved to be its own extended ordeal. Executives at Fox Searchlight Pictures struggled to find a coherent angle, at one point, seriously considering positioning Fight Club as an art house film rather than a mainstream studio release. Internal research suggested the film's appeal skewed heavily toward male audiences given its violent content, and marketers worried that even Brad Pitt's star power would not be enough to draw significant numbers of women into theaters. Test research did turn up one encouraging signal. The film appeared to resonate strongly with teenage viewers, a demographic detail that would later prove double edged given the film's adult themes. Fincher pushed back hard against early marketing instincts that wanted to center the campaign entirely on Pitt's star image, and instead encouraged the studio to bring in the advertising agency Whedon Plus Kennedy to develop a more distinctive campaign. The agency's most memorable pitch involved using a bar of pink soap embossed simply with the film's title as the centerpiece marketing image, a concept that struck Fox executives as, in essence, a bad joke rather than a viable campaign, and it was rejected. Fincher also produced two early trailers of his own devising, styled as mock public service announcements, fronted by Pitt and Norton in character. The studio again felt these did not effectively sell the film to a broad audience. In the end, Fox opted for a far more conventional and expensive route, financing a marketing push worth roughly $20 million that included a traditional press junket, posters, billboards, and television spots built around the film's fight sequences rather than its psychological or satirical content. Notably, some of that television advertising ran during World Wrestling Federation broadcasts, a placement Fincher specifically protested, believing it framed the film in exactly the wrong context for audiences and reduced it to little more than a violent spectacle. Linson later placed a good deal of blame for the film's disappointing domestic box office directly on what he characterized as an ill conceived, one dimensional marketing strategy overseen by the studio's marketing executive. Music Fincher's approach to the film's score reflected the same appetite for unconventional collaborators that shaped so much of the production. He worried that composers experienced in traditional film scoring would default to familiar orchestral or thematic approaches unsuited to the film's fractured, ironic tone, and instead wanted a band with no prior film scoring experience at all, reasoning that such collaborators would have no inherited habits to unlearn. His first choice was the British band Radiohead, but frontman Tom York turned down the opportunity, still recovering at the time from the considerable stress of promoting the band's celebrated 1997 album, OK Computer. With Radiohead unavailable, Fincher instead commissioned the production duo known as the Dust Brothers, best known at the time for their work in hip hop and sample based production, to build the score. The result was a distinctly postmodern soundscape woven together from drum loops, electronic scratches, and heavily processed samples rather than any conventional orchestral writing. Dust Brothers member Michael Simpson later described the collaboration as an extension of Fincher's broader ambition for the entire project. The director wanted to break new ground across every element of the film, and a non traditional, electronically built score was simply one more way of achieving that departure from convention, beyond the Dust Brothers' original score. The film makes memorable use of a single pre existing needle drop at its climax and over its end credits. Where is My Mind? By the alternative rock band Pixies, a song originally released well over a decade earlier. Its placement over the film's final images, Marla and the narrator watching the skyline collapse around them, gave the track a second life with new audiences, a connection that members of the band would later credit with substantially reviving interest in their music among listeners who had not encountered the Pixies' original 1980s output. Release Theatrical Fight Club held its world premiere at the 56th Venice International Film Festival on September 10, 1999, a launch that immediately signaled the film's ambitions towards serious critical consideration rather than a straightforward commercial rollout. Ahead of the American theatrical release, the studio commissioned the National Research Group to conduct test screenings and generate box office projections. That research predicted an opening weekend gross somewhere between $13 million dollars and $15 million domestically, a modest but respectable figure for a film of its budget and provocative subject matter. The film opened commercially across the United States and Canada on October 15, 1999, playing in 963 theaters and earning approximately $11 million dollars over its opening weekend, a total that placed it in first position at the domestic box office that weekend, ahead of other new releases including Double Jeopardy and The Story of Us. Despite claiming the top spot, the opening figure still landed below the studio's own pre release expectations, an early sign of the mixed commercial reception that would follow the film through the remainder of its theatrical run. Audience data compiled by CinemaScore captured some of the underlying tension in how filmgoers responded. Polled audiences gave the film an average grade of B minus on the service's letter grade scale, running from A plus down to F, a lukewarm score, suggesting that even those who chose to see the film opening weekend came away with distinctly mixed feelings rather than enthusiastic endorsement. The demographic makeup of the opening weekend audience skewed noticeably male at roughly 61% versus 39% female, and skewed young as well, with 58% of the audience under the age of 21. Details that lend some credibility to descriptions of the film circulating at the time as, in essence, the ultimate anti date movie, poorly suited to shared viewing between romantic partners with differing tolerances for its violence and tone. The film's box office trajectory weakened quickly after its opening weekend. In its second weekend, Fight Club saw ticket sales drop by roughly 42.6%, bringing in about $6.3 million, dollars, a steep decline that suggested the film was not generating the kind of positive word of mouth momentum that can sustain a theatrical run over subsequent weeks. By the end of its original theatrical release, Fight Club had grossed roughly $37 million dollars across the United States and Canada, supplemented by approximately $63.8 million dollars from international territories, for a worldwide theatrical total of about $100.9 million dollars. Later re releases would push that cumulative worldwide figure up to roughly $102 million dollars over time, but measured strictly against its production budget of $63 million to $65 million, dollars, plus the tens of millions spent on marketing. The film's initial theatrical performance fell well short of what the studio had hoped for going in. The financial disappointment carried consequences beyond the film itself. The underwhelming North American box office performance strained the relationship between 20th Century Fox studio head Bill Mechanic and News Corporation head Rupert Murdoch, tension that contributed to Mechanic's eventual resignation from the studio in June 2000. A reminder of how a single high profile release, particularly one built around a director's uncompromising vision, can ripple outward into the corporate politics surrounding a studio's leadership. International censorship and classification proved to be another significant thread in the film's theatrical rollout. Ahead of its November 12, 1999 release in the United Kingdom, the British Board of Film Classification reviewed Fight Club and required the removal of two specific scenes depicting what the board characterized as an indulgence in the excitement of beating a defenseless man's face to a pulp. With those cuts made, the board assigned the film an 18 certificate, restricting its theatrical release in the UK to adult audiences only. Notably, the BBFC went no further than that limited excision. It explicitly considered and rejected broader claims that the film contained dangerously instructive material or might encourage antisocial behavior in viewers, concluding instead that the film as a whole was clearly critical of and sharply satirical toward the amateur fascism it depicted, and that its central themes around male aggression and its consequences were ultimately and emphatically rejected by the story's own central character by the film's end. The two scenes trimmed for the UK theatrical release were eventually restored for a two-disc DVD edition released in that market in March 2007. Decades later, in February 2024, Ahead of a planned theatrical re-release, the BBFC revisited its original classification and lowered the certificate from 18 down to 15, reflecting a shift in standards over the intervening quarter century. Home media Fight Club's afterlife on home video would ultimately eclipse its theatrical performance in significance, and much of that owed to Fincher's own unusually hands on involvement in the format. He personally supervised the composition of the DVD packaging, making him one of the earliest major directors to treat a film's transition to home media as a creative extension of the theatrical release rather than a purely commercial afterthought. The film arrived on DVD on June 6, 2000, released simultaneously in both single disc and two disc special editions. The primary movie disc carried four separate audio commentary tracks, an unusually generous number for the era, while the accompanying bonus disc on the two disc edition packed in behind the scenes footage, deleted scenes, theatrical trailers, mock theater safety public service announcements consistent with the film's satirical tone, the promotional music video for This Is Your Life, early internet advertising spots, photo galleries, cast biographies, storyboards, and additional publicity material. Fincher approached the DVD as an opportunity to complete his artistic vision for the project in ways the theatrical cut alone could not fully capture. Julie Markel, then serving as 20th Century Fox's Senior Vice President of Creative Development, described the packaging as a deliberate extension of the film's own thematic concerns, framing it as an experience meant to provoke questions rather than simply present information, one that would reward closer attention the more a viewer engaged with it. The studio reportedly spent 2 months developing the packaging design alone. The resulting two-disc special edition arrived wrapped or resembled plain brown cardboard packaging bound with what appeared to be twine, with the Fight Club title stamped diagonally across the front in a manner evoking a hastily assembled contraband parcel rather than a polished retail product. Markel described the intended effect as a deliberate contrast between the plain, understated simplicity of the outer wrapping and the intensity and chaos of the film contained within it. Deborah Mitchell, the studio's vice president of marketing at the time, offered a more retail minded assessment of the same packaging, noting its strong shelf presence as a selling point in stores. The release also carried a notable technical distinction. It was the first DVD ever issued featuring THX's Optimode calibration technology, allowing home theater owners to optimize their systems specifically for that disc's audio and video presentation. The disc's quality and thoroughness did not go unrecognized within the industry. Fight Club won three separate prizes at the Online Film Critics Society's 2000 Awards, honoring the best DVD release of the year, the best audio commentary, and the best collection of special features. The following year, Entertainment Weekly placed the film's two-disc edition in first position on its list of the 50 essential DVDs, singling it out for both the quality of its bonus content and the technical fidelity of its picture and sound. When that original two-disc edition eventually went out of print, persistent demand from fans led the studio to reissue it again in 2004. The commercial numbers behind the home video release were striking, given the film's comparatively soft theatrical run. Within its first decade of availability, the film sold more than 6 million copies across DVD and VHS formats combined, making it one of the best-selling home media titles in the studio's entire history. And it generated more than $55 million in video and DVD rental revenue on top of outright sales. Taken together, a weak North American theatrical performance, a somewhat stronger international theatrical showing, and an unusually strong home video run. The overall math worked out in the studio's favor. Fight Club eventually generated approximately $10 million in profit once all revenue streams were accounted for, a modest but real return that belied its rocky theatrical reception. Beyond the mainstream DVD editions, the film's home media history includes a number of more specialized releases. A Laserdisc edition was issued, though only in Japan, on May 26, 2000, distinguished by unique cover art and by being among the very small number of Laserdisc releases ever to carry a Dolby Digital Surround EX soundtrack. A more conventional VHS edition followed on October 31, 2000, released as part of 20th Century Fox's premiere series line and including a bonus featurette titled Behind the Brawl. Nearly a decade after its theatrical debut, Fight Club made the jump to Blu ray in the United States on November 17, 2009. For that release, the studio commissioned 5 different graffiti artists to contribute a total of 30 individual pieces of artwork for the packaging, drawing on urban visual styles associated with both the East and West coasts of the United States, as well as broader influences from European street art traditions. A packaging choice clearly meant to echo the film's anti establishment themes. In a small, playful touch consistent with Fincher's ongoing engagement with the format, the Blu ray edition opens with a false menu screen for the unrelated 1999 romantic comedy Never Been Kissed, starring Drew Barrymore, before transitioning into the actual Fight Club menu, a gag for which Fincher reportedly obtained Barrymore's personal permission in advance. The film's international home media and streaming history has occasionally intersected with censorship concerns as well. An online release of the film in China, distributed through the technology company, Tencent altered the film's ending significantly, removing the depiction of the credit card company, skyscrapers being destroyed by Project Mayhem's bombs, and replacing it with an added message indicating that Project Mayhem's plot had been thwarted by authorities, with Tyler Durden instead shown being arrested by law enforcement and confined to an asylum until the year 2012, a change that notably moved the film's ending closer to the mental institution conclusion found in Palahniuk's original novel rather than the theatrical film's ending. Following public criticism of the altered version, Tencent released a revised cut weeks later that restored 11 of the 12 minutes that had originally been trimmed. Palahniuk himself weighed in publicly on the controversy, suggesting that the censored Chinese ending arguably brought the film back into closer alignment with his own original vision for the story's conclusion. Most recently, in October 2024, Fincher confirmed that he would personally oversee a new 4K remaster of the film, a restoration project that eventually resulted in a 4K Ultra HD Blu ray release on May 12, 2026, issued by Sony Pictures Home Entertainment. A release that underscored just how enduring commercial and critical interest in the film has remained more than a quarter century after its initial, financially underwhelming theatrical run. Reception box office considered purely in commercial terms, Fight Club's theatrical performance told a story of modest disappointment rather than outright failure. Set against a production budget of $63 million to $65 million, plus a marketing spend in the neighborhood of $20 million, the film's worldwide theatrical gross of roughly $100. $9 million later nudged up to about $102 million through subsequent releases, left relatively little room for profit through ticket sales alone. Domestically, the film opened strongly enough to claim the top spot at the weekend box office, but its underlying trajectory, including a steep 42.6% drop in its second weekend, signaled that it lacked the word of mouth momentum needed to sustain a long, profitable theatrical run in the way many successful studio films of the era did. The National Research Group's pre release projection of a $13 million to $15 million opening weekend proved only roughly accurate at best, with the film's actual opening haul of about $11 million falling short even of that relatively modest forecast. Given the film's polarizing content and challenging marketing history, this shortfall was not entirely surprising to those close to the production, but it nonetheless confirmed the underlying commercial anxiety that had shadowed the project from its earliest test screenings through its repeatedly delayed release date. Its ultimate $37 million domestic total, weighed against tens of millions in combined production and marketing costs, meant the film functioned as a net loser in pure theatrical terms within North America, with the picture only turning meaningfully profitable once international theatrical revenue and especially the surprisingly robust home video market were factored into the studio's overall accounting. The ripple effects of that underwhelming domestic commercial showing extended well beyond the film's own balance sheet. The strain it placed on the relationship between studio chief Bill Mechanic and News Corporation's Rupert Murdoch is frequently cited as a contributing factor in Mechanic's eventual departure from 20th Century Fox in mid 2000, illustrating how a single, ambitious, difficult project, even one that would later be reassessed far more favorably, could carry real professional consequences for the executives who championed it at the time. Critical response, critical reaction to Fight Club upon its release was famously and durably split, a divide that began almost immediately at its Venice Film Festival premiere and continued to play out across major American and international outlets throughout the film's theatrical run. Writing some months after the fact for the magazine, cineastic critic Gary Crowdus offered a useful summary of the overall critical landscape. Many critics praised the film enthusiastically, treating it as one of the most exciting, original, and genuinely thought provoking releases of the year. While an equally vocal, and by his account even louder, contingent of detractors focused their objections on what they saw as excessively graphic depictions of violence, which they worried amounted to a mindless glorification of brutality and a morally irresponsible spectacle that risked inspiring impressionable young viewers to start real fight clubs of their own. That split was visible from the film's very first public screenings. Coverage of the Venice premiere described the reaction among assembled critics as fiercely divided, with one contemporary report noting simply that many in attendance loved the film and just as many hated it in roughly equal measure. Some critics at the time drew an explicit parallel to the moral panic that had followed the British debut of Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange nearly 3 decades earlier, worrying aloud that Fight Club might likewise inspire copycat violence among viewers who took its content as instruction rather than commentary. When the film opened theatrically, a widely cited assessment held that it had struck a genuine nerve regarding contemporary masculinity, one debated in newspapers across multiple countries in the weeks that followed. Even as the filmmakers themselves described their work as an honest, accurate portrayal of a certain kind of 1990s manhood, some critics characterized it instead as irresponsible and appalling. One prominent piece for an Australian newspaper went so far as to frame the film as the most contentious mainstream Hollywood treatment of violence since Kubrick's own controversial classic. Among the more influential positive assessments, Janet Maslin's review for the New York Times praised both Fincher's direction and the film's editing, characterizing its underlying message as a meaningful statement about contemporary manhood, while cautioning that a less attentive viewer might come away misreading the film as an endorsement of violence and nihilism rather than a critique of it. That tension between surface spectacle and underlying intent would become one of the most persistent threads running through the film's critical legacy, echoed by numerous other reviewers who felt the film's stylistic energy risked overwhelming its satirical purpose for at least some portion of its audience. Roger Ebert, reviewing for the Chicago Sun-Times, landed on a notably more skeptical assessment, awarding the film 2 stars out of a possible four. He described it as visceral and hard edged, but ultimately characterized it as a thrill ride masquerading as philosophy, praising its promising opening stretch while criticizing its middle section for pandering to macho sensibilities and dismissing its final act outright as mere trickery. Ebert would return to the film more than once in later years, at one point candidly acknowledging that it was a film beloved by most critics and audiences, but not by him personally. Invited years later to give a shot by shot analysis of the film at the Conference on World Affairs. He reflected that watching it repeatedly over the course of a week had only deepened his admiration for its craft while further diminishing his respect for its underlying ideas. Other major critics staked out positions somewhere between full throated praise and Ebert's pointed skepticism. J. Carr, writing for the Boston Globe, described the film as opening with an invigorating, nervy imaginative energy before eventually collapsing into what he called explosive silliness by its later stretches. Newsweek's David Anson characterized the film as an outrageous mixture of genuinely brilliant technique, adolescent philosophizing, sharp satire, and overwhelming sensory assault, adding that he found the film's ending overly pretentious. Time magazine's Richard Schickel offered a more sustained visual reading of the film's mise en scène, describing its dark, damp imagery as reinforcing a contrast between the sterile above ground existence of its characters and their grimier underground lives, framing water and blood within the film as symbols of authentic living, even at their most polluted or violently spilled. Schickel praised the performances of both Pitt and Norton, while criticizing what he saw as a conventionally gimmicky narrative unfolding and a failure to render Bonham Carter's character as genuinely interesting in her own right. Among the most severe critical reactions came from British critic Alexander Walker, writing for the London Evening Standard under the blunt headline, A Nazi Piece of Work. Walker's review characterized the film's underlying story as a paradigm for the rise of the Hitler state, going so far as to describe it as an assault on personal decency and on society itself, and drawing a direct line between the film's content and historical fascist propaganda. Excerpts from Walker's harshly negative review were later included, alongside other critical opinions, in the printed booklet packaged with the film's 2000 DVD release. A somewhat unusual choice that suggests the filmmakers and studio were comfortable, even eager, to present the full breadth of the film's polarized reception directly to home viewers rather than curating only favorable notices. Aggregated critical scores from review compiling websites captured this genuine, persistent split in more quantitative terms, even as they landed on an overall favorable verdict. Metacritic, surveying 36 critics, classified 24 of those reviews as positive, 10 as mixed, and only 2 as outright negative, yielding an aggregate score of 67 out of 100, a figure the site itself categorized as indicating generally favorable reviews rather than the more emphatic praise typically associated with the very highest scoring films. Rotten Tomatoes, surveying a considerably larger pool of 247 critics, recorded an 81% positive rating, with the site's summarized critical consensus praising the film's solid acting, striking direction, and elaborate production design as adding up to what it described as a wild ride for viewers. Award recognition for the film during its initial release window was comparatively modest given the scale of its eventual cultural reputation. Fight Club received a single Academy Award nomination for Best Sound Editing, though it ultimately lost that category to The Matrix. Helena Bonham Carter, by contrast, fared considerably better on the award circuit, winning the Empire Award for Best British Actress in 2000 for her performance as Marla Singer. The Online Film Critics Society nominated the film across several categories, including Best Film, Best Director, Best Actor for Norton, Best Editing, and Best Adapted Screenplay for Owls, though the film ultimately went home empty handed in each of those specific categories. The organization did, however, still name Fight Club one of the 10 best films of 1999 overall. The film's unconventional score also earned a nomination at the Brit Awards, though it lost that category to the soundtrack for Notting Hill. Looking back at the initial critical divide, with the benefit of hindsight, it is striking how thoroughly Fight Club's reputation would eventually shift in the years following its rocky theatrical run. The film came to be widely regarded as one of the most controversial and talked about releases of the entire 1990s, frequently discussed alongside other formerly adventurous films from that same year, including Magnolia, Being John Malkovich, and Three Kings, as part of a broader wave of American cinema recognized for pushing new developments in filmmaking technology and narrative structure. Word of mouth following its theatrical run, combined with the unusually strong critical and commercial reception of its home video release, gradually transformed the film's standing from a divisive box office disappointment into a genuine cult classic, one that David Anson of Newsweek would later predict was destined for what he called perennial fame among successive generations of viewers. On the film's 10th anniversary in 2009, the New York Times went so far as to describe it as the defining cult movie of its era, a reassessment that stands in sharp, almost ironic contrast to the anxious studio screenings, hesitant marketing campaigns, and lukewarm opening weekend audience grades that had greeted the film exactly a decade earlier. Reviews. Number one, the 1999 adaptation of Chuck Palahniuk's Anarchist novel was misunderstood by some as an agent of chaos, but it remains an eerily forward facing film. David Fincher's Fight Club was released 20 years ago. It was a crystal ball that was mistaken for a cultural crisis, much like Do the Right Thing had been a decade earlier and perhaps Joker is now. Filmmakers who were trying to identify a violence nesting in the culture were accused of trying to incite it, or at least clumsily juggling lit sticks of dynamite. No less an authority than Roger Ebert opened his review of Fincher's film by calling it the most frankly and cheerfully fascist big star movie since Death Wish, echoing widespread concern that impressionable men would lock into the empowering brutality of Tyler Durden and the army that gathers around him. Viewed from a certain angle, it looked like a recruitment film. What cannot be predicted, however, is how items like Fight Club will shift during flight. It becomes easier to appreciate the ambiguities of the film when it no longer feels like a clear and present danger. That doesn't necessarily mean that Fincher's point of view isn't confusing or contradictory all these years later, but the culture tends to move quickly from threat to threat, and it's helpful to have enough distance to see the world it's depicting more clearly. Whatever you think about Fight Club in 2019, it's probably not exactly what you thought about it in 1999, if only because so much of what it describes has manifested itself in the real world or been distorted beyond recognition. Let's begin at the end, as the film does, when a series of detonations leads to the collapse of downtown office buildings. It wouldn't even be 2 years later that a terrorist cell would bring down the World Trade Center towers, those symbols of American financial might, and the motives of Al Qaeda and the film's Project Mayhem are not that dissimilar. Both were attacking the soft center of America as they understood it. Except in Fight Club, the idea was to raise the country to the ground and start over because consumerism had anesthetized it and hollowed out its soul. The final image of two people holding hands as the Pixies is, "Where is my mind?" Blair's on the soundtrack could be seen as nihilistic, but it's secretly thrilling to imagine the possibilities of starting over after a hard reboot. It also helps to know that the explosions are about taking down institutions, not people, more the weather underground than Osama bin Laden. It all begins, as many terrible things do, with the pissy aggrievement of a young white male, much like Ron Livingston in Office Space, another cult classic from the same year. Edward Norton's unnamed narrator has gotten tired of the deadening routines that define his life. The difference is that cubicle culture alone isn't what's bothering Norton, but his realization that he's a cog into a terrible corporate machine. His day job is to calculate the necessity of automobile recalls under a formula. Take the number of vehicles in the field, A, multiply by the probable rate of failure, B, multiply by the average out of court settlement, C, A times B times C equals X. If X is less than the cost of a recall, we don't do one. Many of his later actions are explained by the emptiness of being defined by the things he buys, most famously, the IKEA catalog that accounts for the interior of his apartment, but his work matters too. He knows firsthand that capitalism will let people die if it's better for the bottom line. The narrator's need to feel something at all draws him first to terminal disease support groups at the local Episcopal Church and later to the anarchist philosophy of Tyler Durden, Brad Pitt, who makes him feel the old fashioned way by punching him hard in the gut. The twist of Tyler's true identity, fully earned, incidentally, by the many times Fincher hints at it, says a lot about the conversation the narrator has with himself about what he thinks he needs and how it develops into a messianic vision that completely gets away from him. But those first punches are an expression of brute masculinity that hit him like a cold splash of water to the face. Men are simple creatures in that way. As the fight clubs metastasize around the country, Tyler's pre brawl speeches shift from stating the rules to spouting off about his generation being the middle children of history, without a world war or a Great Depression to give it purpose. Our Great War is a spiritual war, he says. Our Great Depression is our lives. The implication is that all that masculine energy needs an outlet. And since Generation X hasn't been provided with one, it will have to find some other way to channel its inchoate rage. And it's here where the film's meaning can get a little slippery. How much of what Tyler is saying is to be understood as nonsense? And if it's not nonsense, then how much does the film implicitly endorse? The fact that the fight clubs lead into Project Mayhem, a, a full on terrorist organization, should lay the second question to rest. In his efforts to satisfy a personal need, the narrator Tyler has set off a brush fire that rages out of control, and he's utterly powerless to keep it from consuming the world. Working from Chuck Palahniuk's novel, Fincher, and his screenwriter, Jim Ulls, only identify with their heroes, up to the point when the narrator, Tyler, still has some control over the situation. The film does recognize a phenomenon where men are waking in anger from a culture intended to numb or emasculate them, but it also sees in that the presence of sickening misogyny and the potential for fascism. And contrary to Ebert's review, it panics right alongside the narrator, who goes so far as to shoot himself in the head to stop it. What Fight Club missed in 1999 and comes oh so close to getting is how much the rage it identifies is connected to white supremacy. But the world it anticipated is now upon us, with a host of Tyler Durden's marshalling attacks on perceived enemies and twisting the meaning of snowflake, a term used in Palahnik's book and popularized in the movie. You are not a beautiful and unique snowflake, to taunt the vulnerable. What are the Proud Boys if not a roving gang of Project Mayhem thugs? Or the Tiki Torch bearers of Charlottesville? Fight Club saw it coming, with thrilling vividness and wit and technical panache. Just don't shoot the messenger. Number two, cast consumerism and capitalism versus humanism. Who you are versus who you think you should be. Do you want to watch more films and have discussions with cinephiles? Join Watch More Films and enjoy weekly film flights, in depth conversations, and mastery series on filmmakers, countries, genres, and movements. What is Fight Club about? Pressure creates stress. Stress evolves into anxiety. Anxiety triggers paralysis. Paralysis causes stagnation. Stagnation gives way to yearning. Yearning begets action. Action leads to catharsis. Catharsis to relief. And that's the story of Fight Club. On the human level, it's the journey from stagnation to rebirth. The journey is bonkers, of course, because exaggeration and dramatization can often capture emotions and parts of reality better than realism. But all of that is only a means to an end. It's the how, but not the why. To understand the why, we have to zoom out from the human level. Fight Club is very concerned with American consumerism, marketing, and corporatization, and how those things strip us of our individuality and sense of identity. Through such societal influences, you're constantly told how to behave, what to buy, how you should look, how you should think, what you should aspire to be, to the point where you can subjugate yourself, forgetting entirely what it is you want, how it is you feel, how to express your true feelings, much less recognize them. To take it to an extreme point, why exist if being you doesn't matter? If you are doing what everyone else does, buying what everyone else buys, saying what everyone else says, is there even a you? Or are you merely another statistic? Fight Club doesn't want you to be a statistic. It wants you to be an individual who is seen, heard, felt, and acting based on your wants, hopes, needs, and dreams. You should be someone who has agency in the world and affects the world. The way in which Fight Club shows this is violent, exaggerated, and kind of absurd, but we're not supposed to recreate the movie in our day to day lives. No one should start a fight club or cause physical damage to a blockbuster, which you can't even do anymore, or a Starbucks or another chain. Don't start a cult or join a cult. If you like Starbucks, you like Starbucks. Just don't like Starbucks because you think you should. Get out there and be who you are. The narrator, Jack, Tyler Durden, Edward Norton, Tyler Durden, Brad Pittmala, singer, Helena Bonham Carter, Robert Paulson, Meat Loaf Angel Face, Jared Leto, The Mechanic, Holt McCallany Ricky, Ian Bailey, Richard Chesler, The Boss, Zach based on Fight Club, a novel by Chuck Palahniuk written by Jim Ulls, directed by David Fincher.